So, Anthony, we all know that ransomware is growing exponentially. It's becoming a threat from every different angle of the interwebs. So, one of the things that I've learned here at Object First is we're designing and getting ready to roll out this new paradigm shift in architectures. And essentially, what we're talking about is zero trust data resiliency, right?
That's right. Zero trust data resilience. It's a new effort that we're actually doing in collaboration with Veeam. And the reason we're doing this, Matt, is because we started to evaluate zero trust by itself and realized it's simply not enough. Anyone that's just touting zero trust as the be all and end all of their data management solution is kind of missing the mark on everything you need. So we thought, hey, let's create something new. Let's establish a new blueprint for a zero trust data resilience architecture. And let's walk you through what it is. So it actually all starts with assuming a breach. Now, this is actually a principle of the original zero trust framework. You have to assume at all times that your infrastructure could be breached by a bad actor. And the reason why you do this is simple. When you act like you have been breached, you're just going to take on a posture of more security and more awareness about what your data is, where you're storing it. Is it secure? Is it protected? Are you ready to detect if there is an intruder in your environment? And it's just a proper state of paranoia to be in.
Yeah, no kidding. I couldn't agree with you more. And, one of the other big important pieces to this, Anthony, is segmentation. Because if you put all your eggs in one basket, it doesn't matter what we're talking about. We could be talking about data protection, your family life or whatever. You put all your eggs in one basket. That's never a good situation. Financial, right? You put all your eggs in one stock. What happens if it plummets? So I feel like segmentation in general is just a great idea in everything that we do, because you're giving yourself additional ways out, right? Additional levels of safeguarding. And when we're talking specifically about this new architecture, that's essentially separating out the backup software from where the backup software sends your data. So the backup storage. So really what this ties into is you think about these all-in-one appliance-based solutions. And if you go back to your primary key bullet that you just touched on, if you assume a breach, if they get in, guess what? They've got the keys to the castle. So what then? So segmentation and being able to break that apart, not only from a backup software and backup storage perspective, but also networking in general. The more segmentation you can implement, the more secure and the least amount of attack vectors you're going to have in your overarching infrastructure. So Anthony, what about immutability in this?
Yeah, this is a perfect segue, Matt. Creating those segmented resiliency zones. If that's step one, being immutable is step two, because having those various baskets to put your eggs in is great. But if someone can just come along and stomp in the basket, then what good are the eggs, right? Immutability is the key feature that makes this data unchangeable, inalterable. Having an immutable resiliency zone where data can land and not be touched by anyone, both good or bad, means that there's no way that breach that could be in there could take the data and do something malicious with it.
Yeah,
now,
totally
Matt,
agree.
What about flexible recovery options?
Yeah, I was about to say, one of the things that really impresses me about Veeam, and in another life, I actually worked at Veeam for many years. And one of the things that I always found really impressive is just mobility of data. Right. And one of the things that, Veeam implemented years ago is essentially a way to extract and recover data, years into the future. And when you look at cloud recovery options, cloud mobility was one of the key efforts at Veeam. So what if you started in Azure, but you've made a business decision to move over to AWS? Can Veeam help with that? And they absolutely can. So this is one of the things that having that portability so that you can restore to dissimilar environments is absolutely critical, because you never know where the industry is going, where your own business is going to take you, the directions in the future that you may have to pivot and call audibles with. So having that flexible recovery functionality in this architecture is a key part of it. And, Anthony, you touched on immutability, but what about access levels and the whole zero access concept?
That's right. So when you think about zero access, think about how do I eliminate any privilege to factory reset the box? How do I eliminate any privilege to remove a God user or administrator who can go in and delete the data regardless of whether or not it's immutable. Many people don't know this, but there's two kinds of immutability. There's governance mode and compliance mode. In governance mode, it's exactly what it sounds like. A governor can come in and turn it off and remove it. So understanding how to take advantage of administrative privileges, set the right roles and responsibilities for your users, assume your users are breached. Getting back to point number one, if you assume your top admin has been breached either via social engineering or any kind of attack, or maybe they are just malicious themselves, then you are thinking with zero trust in mind, and you're building a role set that is actually aware of how you can prevent even your top privileged user from deleting the data. Now, Matt, what about resiliency zones, multiple security domains, the 3-2-1 backup rule?
The 3-2-1. So I look at this like secure by design. If you secure by design when you're building out your infrastructure, this is going to become easy, right? So when we're talking about data security and resiliency domains, is you need to separate the lock from the key. So if you're backing up on-prem and that's the only place your backups are going, that's one data security domain. All it takes is one intrusion and you could be game, right? You could be game over. So the whole idea with the 3-2-1 and more recently the 3-2-1-1-0 is you've really got to get the 3 copies of your data. Now remember, most of you guys watching this likely know what the 3-2-1 is. 3 copies of data, production does count as one of those. 2 different media types. And Anthony, I remember in the old days, 2 different media types was disk and tape.
That's
but
right.
Now you've got object storage. You've got all kinds of different ways that you can differentiate the data set. So the 2 variable. One, arguably the most important here is get one off site. You can't have all your eggs in that one basket like we just touched on. It's got to be geographically diverse in some way, whether that's the cloud, your secondary data center, on the other side of the earth, whatever the case is, separate the lock from the key. And then the 1-0, the extra 1-0 is you've got to have immutability like you just touched on. You've got to have one that can't be altered. In the old days, this was air gapping. Air gapping is still very much relevant and effective. If you have a tape infrastructure, you pull the tape out, guess what? There's no amount of software that's going to jump through the atmosphere and land on a tape, right? So air gapping still is very effective. And then lastly, you've got to check all this stuff for issues. So 0 stands for 0 errors. And I know in Veeam, version 12.1 and beyond, they're implementing even more creative ways to leverage sure backup in a randomized fashion so that you can actually test before you go to the links to diversify the data, to create these resiliency zones, to increase your security domains. You need to test to make sure that if this time comes, when it comes, you've got the confidence to know that the backups that you've sent to the cloud, to object storage on-prem, to the other side of the earth, those are recoverable because you've got the proof. So Anthony, when we talk about all that and access levels and immutability and intrusions, what's one of the ways to make sure nobody can get in there and pull levers they shouldn't be pulling?
I know some people probably were listening to the last point about access and they're like, well, how do I, as the top admin, protect myself? How do I stop myself from being compromised and getting through the attack surface? And the answer is simple. You rely on your vendor. If you're not working with a vendor that does the principle of 0 access to root, that means that no admin has the ability to get into the root operating system account and do damage via that vector. You are not in a fully secure environment. Now, the whole point of 0 access to root is it puts the onus on someone like us, Object First. OOTB is a 0 access to root device, meaning that even the most privileged OOTB admin cannot access our base operating system or root account, meaning no amount of privilege or breach would allow a bad actor to get in and remove that data. So this is one you actually have to do some research and shopping around. Not every vendor supports 0 access today. And that's truly how you level up your access game. Now, speaking of accessing things, what about just typical visibility and analytics?
Yeah, Anthony, one of the things I wanted to double down on the access to root before we talk about that is, one of the things when you look at other vendors, immutability is always the hot button. Yes, we have immutability. Yes, we have worm volumes, right? The write once, read many solutions. And we've got all these strategies to implement immutability. But guess what they all have in common, Anthony? Somebody has to configure them. Somebody has admin rights to go in there and actually do those, to set those up. And that's why the last bullet you touched on is so absolutely critical to a truly secure environment, is that's already preset. Before Ubi even gets into the crate and comes to your site, it's already marked immutable with zero access to the root account, meaning you can't configure RAID sets. You can't change stripe sizes. All that is pre-built and designed in accordance with Veeam best practices before it even leaves the factory. So that's correct. Fundamentally different than all the other solutions that I've personally seen in the space.
That's absolutely correct, Matt. And when you do your evaluations of all the solutions out there, if they're not meeting all these checkboxes, then you are buying something and you're putting yourself in a position where you could be compromised via a breach. And one more thing I want to add is we often focus on the attacker, but something that still happens time and time again is disasters. And part of this plan is ensuring disaster resilience as well. Attackers love bad news, and we've seen how they will take advantage of any scenario. So think about what would happen if your primary data center went down and you had to rely on only that secondary location, be it cloud or a colo. If a natural disaster occurs, is your secondary location zero trust data resilient as well? And these are just the kind of questions we want you to be thinking about and asking yourself when it comes to your data protection, your data management, and how you stay ahead of the curve. So everything we've talked about so far is part of our zero trust data resilient architecture. And you'd also find a lot of these points in typical zero trust language. But we want to double down on just 3 more points that we think are absolutely necessary that you evaluate when building out this kind of architecture. And the first is an industry standard S3 native immutability solution that is secured with least privilege access and IAM by default. Excuse me, having just a little bit of a brain fart. It's key that when you are looking to purchase and evaluate new solutions, that they check all of the boxes and don't miss anything. One single missing piece or feature functionality from this list could mean compromise on the software's end. And that's all it takes. One weak link in the chain and everything falls apart.
Yeah, totally agree. And the other point to mention here is the S3 communication protocol in general. So when you look at legacy storage systems, JBOD, NASes, for an example, likely they're going to show up on the backup server as a map drive, as an CIF share, SMB share. So when you think about a malicious software that could infiltrate the environment, what's the first thing it's going to try to do? Land and expand. It's going to see what it can discover and see where else it can go before it even activates and starts locking things down. So when you think about S3 communication, there is no record of this in the Veeam server. The only place it's there is in the backend Veeam database once you add it in as a repository. So it's all HTTPS, it's secured during transit. So when you look at just one additional way you can help to minimize an additional attack vector, it's the protocol itself. It's the way that S3 is communicated with over API versus just being able to browse the file system, right there in Windows. And, lastly, Anthony, what about the design and architecture?
That's right. So you're talking about minimizing the attack surface. And when we think about attack surfaces, we often think about, what is the location, whether it's a data center, cloud, our backup storage appliance that is going to be attacked. And many have chosen to go with a black box type approach, where it's sort of this all-in-one nebulous thing that is not fully understood by the end user. Now, this can be great from hey, I just want a simple, easy stop and click and go one-stop shop. But what that also opens up to is when the black box fails, you have no idea as to why. So it's very important to always be considerate of an open design architecture, meaning that you have full understanding of every piece of software and hardware that is part of your zero trust data resilient architecture. Now, by doing this, if something does fail, if something does get breached, you will have all the knowledge you need to stay resilient by taking advantage of those other pieces and the other resiliency zones. By going black box, when, like Matt said earlier, the black box fails, you are up a creek, very specific creek, missing a paddle. So it's just important to think about how all these pieces work together and how you can take advantage by separating and creating those resiliency zones and making sure that every piece of the puzzle is secure, minimize that attack surface, and takes advantage of all the other zero trust data resilience principles we talked about here.
Yeah, completely agree. And really the last thing I wanted to end on, Anthony, is you made a comment earlier about visibility analytics and some other things. And one of the things I wanted to double down on that is, this is a Veeam ecosystem that we're talking about here, right? It's Veeam plus object first, OOPI by object first. And Veeam has a ton of ways to get analytical data, to do orchestration, like disaster recovery orchestrator and other things where you can actually create runbook documentation on what to do during a disaster. OOPI being plugged into Veeam with that SOS integration is just one more additional piece to that comes under the Veeam umbrella when you think about automation, orchestration, governance, analytical data. So we do have some analytics on our own web UI where you can look at performance and what the unit is doing. But at a higher level, when you look at this architecture in general, it's really being driven by Veeam. And that's what we do. We work the best with Veeam. We are the best storage for Veeam. So with that, Anthony, I think this is a great video to kind of highlight this architecture. I think it's brilliant. And I think everyone should be subscribing to this because like we always say, right? It's not if you get attacked or if you have a failure, if you have a disaster, it's when. So what do you do when that happens? Are you ready? Are you prepped? So what are your final thoughts, Anthony?
Assume that breach, right, Matt?
Yes.
Just like you said, it's not a matter of if, but when. So if you're living in a state of assuming that you're already breached, you are one step ahead of the attacker.
Yep. Absolutely. Thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you on the next one.